I'm Dana Breckwald. I am the Assistant Planning Director for Climate Adaptation. We're really glad you could join us for this webinar in our Subregional Plan Essentials series, the last in a series. Just to start, if you haven't already, please update your Zoom name and include your name and affiliation so we know who's in the room. And as a reminder, this session is being recorded and we will share the slides and recording on our website afterwards. So this Planning Essentials series was developed in response to questions we've been hearing from local governments about subregional plan development, and it's designed to help clarify what is expected for plan elements and provide guidance on how to approach each element. So today's session will focus on how we centered equity in the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan with an emphasis on our equity assessment standard and how it's applied across the plan. Before we dive in, just a couple of quick logistical notes. We'd love for you to use the chat to share your thoughts. But if you have a question for presenters, please drop that in the Q&A box so we don't miss it. You can see the little Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Looks like a little speech bubble with a question mark. And feel free to submit questions at any time during the presentation, and we'll try to get to all of them during the Q&A section at the end. If we aren't able to answer your question live, we will include an answer in our written Q&A doc that you can find on our website after the webinar. So just introducing our panelists here today, I introduced myself, Dana Breckwald. I'm joined by two of my colleagues at BCDC and two of our environmental justice advisors. So from BCDC, we have Dalila Adolfo. She is the manager for climate equity and community engagement, and Sabrina Lopez, who is our climate adaptation planner. From our environmental justice advisors, we have Nama Raz Yassif, Senior Manager of the Climate Ready Communities Program at the Watershed Project, and Julio Garcia, who is the Executive Director of Rise South City. We're very glad to have them here today and have them share their perspectives and expertise. So to frame today's discussion, we are focusing on three things. First, how equity shaped the RSAP and why that matters for local adaptation planning. Second, what the equity assessment standard requires and how it shows up across the plan. And then third, how to apply these ideas in the equity assessment standard in practice to inform real planning decisions and outcomes. So we'll start with a quick RSAP refresher in case you're new here or have just forgotten what RSAP stands for. Part one will cover how equity was built into the RSAP as we were developing it. In part two, we'll cover the equity assessment standard, what it is, and then in part three, we'll focus on what that looks like in practice. We'll wrap up with some key takeaways and leave time for questions at the end. So here's a quick refresher on what the Regional Shoreline Adaptation Plan, or RSAP, is. The RSAP guides local sea level rise planning and helps ensure compliance with California Senate Bill 272. The RSAP guidelines includes guidelines which outline all the required components for preparing a subregional adaptation plan, and these guidelines are organized around plan elements and minimum standards. There are 7 plan elements, A through G, that make up a complete subregional plan. Element A spans the whole plan and documents the planning process. Elements B and C focus on understanding the local context, including existing conditions and vulnerabilities due to sea level rise. And elements D through G cover selecting adaptation strategies and moving them towards implementation. This structure ensures that each plan we receive reflects local conditions while staying consistent with regional priorities. So in addition to the guidelines, which outlines what the plan should contain, the minimum standards are essential requirements that every subregional plan must meet. There are 4 standards. The first is the Coastal Flood Hazards and Sea Level Rise Scenario Standard. Plans have to include these hazards that you see here and scenarios at a minimum, though local jurisdictions can include additional hazards or scenarios if they're relevant. Second is the Minimum Categories and Asset Standard. This contains all the physical, environmental, social, and economic issues that must be considered to ensure that risk assessment and adaptation strategies respond to essential services and community resources. Third, the Equity Assessment Standard ensures that plans evaluate impacts on vulnerable populations and integrate equity throughout the planning process. And this is the standard that we'll be focusing on today. And finally, our Adaptation Strategy Standard, which guides the selection of strategies that are practical, effective, and support long-term resilience. So together, these standards create a consistent, scientifically based, and equitable foundation while allowing plans to reflect local conditions. So this brings us to part one, building the RSAP with equity. I'll turn it over now to Sabrina, who will walk us through how equity was incorporated into the development of the RSAP.
Thanks, Dana, and hello, everyone. I'll be starting us off today with just a little background, and this includes acknowledging the reality of past planning decisions and their implications. Historically, planning processes have overlooked vulnerable communities and reinforced existing inequities. And because of this, it's really important that we include an intentional focus on equity considerations and utilizing an equity lens to sea level rise and shoreline adaptation to prevent further exacerbating these already existing disparities. So this is why the RSAP centers equity as a core planning principle. That means that equity shaped how the RSAP was developed, it shaped what the RSAP requires, and it's not treated as a standalone topic or an additional add-on. It's integrated throughout the entirety of the guidelines. And this sets the expectation that equity considerations are a part of every planning decision guided by the RSAP. And when we talk about equity in planning, we mean putting people at the center of decision making. It's about acknowledging that sea level rise will disproportionately impact low income communities, communities of color, and indigenous communities who are already facing higher environmental burdens and responding to that reality. It's about making sure that everyone has fair access and that barriers to participation are removed. It's about hearing different voices and perspectives and using them to shape meaningful decisions. And it's a commitment to transparency, ongoing engagement, and tracking actions to improve outcomes for all communities. So, how did BCDC get to this moment? Well, the equity standard in the RSAP is the result of work that happened over time that laid a foundation for making equity central to RSAP development. So in 2019, environmental justice and social equity policies were adopted into the Bay Plan, which formally acknowledged the region's history of inequity and established expectations that planning decisions must consider impacts on socially vulnerable communities, not just in intent, but in outcomes. From 2020 to 21, the Bay Adapt platform process built on that, where hundreds of participants across the region, including agencies, stakeholders, and community members, came together through working groups, public forums, and focus groups to develop a shared regional strategy for rising sea levels. And throughout this period, community advocates, including Rise South City, Miss Margaret, and others, played a really critical role in pushing BCDC and regional partners to embed equitable processes and practice in real decisions and implementation. In 2021, BCDC formalized its environmental justice advisors. And the EJ advisors bring extensive expertise and unique perspectives from community-based organizations serving socially vulnerable, underrepresented, indigenous, and environmental justice communities, helping ensure that those perspectives are present in planning and decision making. So I'm actually going to hand it over now to our EJ advisor, Julio, to talk a little bit about his experience participating on the BADAP subcommittee.
Thank you. I think, from the perspective of a community-based organization and the other ones who participated there, I think all voices needed to be heard. It was not a planning the cities and counties and other institutions are planning. It was being included and being respected in the process. So we have several meetings that we were just trying to have these hard conversations about community inclusion and community participation. Usually, we are in our silos and everybody does what they do. But this process, it took a long time. But one of the majority of our concerns about including populations, especially the ones who are front fence, frontline communities and the low-income communities, and monolingual populations. So they are in the plan, and I think we're still there and we're still working, and we're part of the uh, EG advisors, and we're part of the Bay Adapt plan. So I think just for us, it is really important to have a voice at the table. And we are representing, and we're the people who represent that voice at the table. And locally, I think we have a great partnership with all the people who are sitting at the table. Thank you, Sabrina.
Thank you, Julio. Um, so moving on, thank you for that experience. So moving on, centering equity in the RSAP, as Julio mentioned, wasn't just a single step. It was built into how the plan was developed from the beginning. So I'm just going to quickly review some of what that process looked like. So BCDC had 5 paid environmental justice representatives who participated directly in advisory group and equity subcommittee meetings. And they were compensated at rates comparable to consultants with formal partnership agreements to ensure that their expertise was recognized and valued as part of the process. The equity subcommittee also played a key role in shaping how equity showed up in practice, helping design meeting structures, participation approaches, and internal processes to ensure equity was reflected not just in outcomes, but also in how decisions were made. We then developed an equity strategy, which was a living document co-created with the equity subcommittee, EJ representatives, and the advisory group that informed how equity considerations were integrated throughout the RSAP from start to finish. Equity was also woven into the outreach and communications plans through a broad range of community engagement events to ensure that diverse voices weren't just invited, but actively included in shaping the plan. So we just hope that this gives a sense of the scale and breadth of engagement that helped shape the RSAP. It wasn't just a single outreach effort, it was a sustained process across many groups, geographies, and formats. And to name a few, there were 9 community pop-up events, 5 workshops hosted by local CPOs, and several at-large public events designed to reach a broader audience. Alongside this, there was an ongoing engagement with advisory groups, technical bodies, elected officials, and interagency partners, reflecting a process shaped by many voices across the whole region. And as we developed the RSAP, we wanted a way to make sure that justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion would be practiced intentionally throughout the development of a sub-regional plan. So this first started with the idea of equity checks, created through discussions with the equity subcommittee. And these checks were designed as an ongoing, iterative way to reflect on both the process and the plan deliverables, asking like whether systems and decisions were supporting equity and removing barriers. But over time, it became clear that the most effective approach would be a required equity assessment. And this would take the concept of the equity checks and turn it into a tool that local jurisdictions could use in their own planning processes. So the equity assessment was shaped and refined through multiple subcommittee meetings where folks identified the key questions and considerations that should guide adaptation planning and help ensure that outcomes benefited vulnerable communities. And through this collaborative process, BCDC developed the final equity assessment, now formalized in the equity assessment standard. And the standard is a required set of equity considerations integrated into each RSAP element, documented in section 3.3.3. Its goal is to ensure fair distribution of adaptation benefits and burdens while delivering tangible equity improvements for socially vulnerable and EJ communities. So that now brings us to part 2, where we're going to take a closer look at the equity assessment standard itself. And I will pass it over to Dalila to walk us through that.
Thanks, Sabrina. Hi, I'm Dalila Dofo, the manager for climate equity and community engagement, and I'll be walking us through how the equity assessment standard shows up in the 7 elements of the RSAP guidelines and why equity is such an important component for developing sub-regional plans. Let's start with element A. The planning process is the first step in creating a sub-regional plan. The equity assessment in this element asks you to build a project team that reflects the diversity of the planning area. This includes taking intentional steps to involve people from vulnerable groups, such as unhoused residents, people with disabilities, youth, and elders. It also includes making the process accessible to multilingual communities through translation, interpreters, and translated materials. Being as inclusionary as possible in the planning team sets the foundation and the tone for the rest of the process. Equitable outreach is another key part. It includes prioritizing engagement in vulnerable communities through local meetings, partnerships with community-based organizations, and Indigenous communities, and providing accommodations like childcare, food, or participatory stipends. A helpful resource for this element is BCDC's Community Vulnerability and CBO Directory Map, which can support in understanding where vulnerable populations are actually located within your community. When we bring these pieces together, they shape how element A is implemented and supports its intended outcome of a meaningful and robust process that engages a diverse mix of stakeholders. Addressing equity in element A ensures that the plan reflects the perspectives of an entire community, not just the parts of a community that are traditionally at the table. This makes it essential to the success of this element and the sub-regional plan overall. For element B, existing conditions, this should paint a picture of the community that's being focused on and what conditions are currently in the community. The equity assessment asks you to consider how communities interact with natural habitats and how healthy ecosystems provide benefits, or examples like flood risk reduction, and add community perspectives on nature-based adaptation versus traditional adaptation strategies. It also involves identifying community assets and services, especially those that support socially vulnerable populations, and understanding land use and housing patterns, including displacement risk, as well as how changes in the development or affordable housing could reduce that risk. Critical infrastructure and essential services are another focus, including where vulnerable communities may rely heavily on certain services or where gaps or vulnerabilities are that could affect their overall well-being. This standard also asks you to consider access and mobility, including public spaces, recreation, and transportation, with attention to where access may be limited or unsafe, or cost prohibitive for vulnerable communities. It also addresses contamination risks, including known and potential hazards, as well as community concerns about environmental health. Finally, it looks at collaborative governance and capacity building, including support for community and tribal participation, and ensuring funding for equitable engagement. Not all of this requires new engagement. Some information can come from existing data sources, such as contaminated sites records or from past planning engagement, if it is recent and directly relevant to the RSAP. The equity assessment for this element helps deepen the understanding of existing physical, ecological, social, and policy conditions that affect adaptation. It brings community priorities and lived experience into the analysis alongside traditional data. And that should lead to a more complete understanding of existing conditions. Moving right along to element C, vulnerable assessment. So for the vulnerability assessment, community input should be directly implemented. This means incorporating community assets and services into your analysis of coastal flood hazards, so the results reflect the assets and services that matter most to residents. It also includes defining priority areas. Communities should help shape which assets and services are included in the more detailed assessment. The equity assessment helps bring together data that was collected in element B and lived experience to better understand where the real risks are. And supporting the intended outcome of element C, which is a targeted summary of exposure and vulnerability that identifies high priority areas. It ensures that lived experiences is reflected in the assessment and includes more than mapped hazards. And I will pass it to Julio to expand on this from a community perspective.
Well, just adding one more element to all this, I think supporting our undocumented communities with safety spaces to provide this feedback. As we know, our undocumented communities are starting to hide, in the shadows again because what is going on with immigration, and we need to acknowledge that and provide really safety spaces for community. What I'm talking about is having a staff member at the door. People, when they come in, they want to choose to put their name or phone number or information in a piece of paper is fine. Otherwise, we just contact as one. Provide the community with stipends. I think is really, really important because they are the experts in the community. So they are the ones who will help you shape the plan with your support. And language is really important for us. Provide as simple as language that we can to explain what's going on and explain it one time, two times, three times, as many times as it takes. So people start realizing what are we talking about, and they start just kind of putting one and one together. But just going back and for safety for our undocumented population is really important in these times. Thank you, Donna.
Thank you, Julio. And moving right along to element D. Element D focuses on adaptation strategies and pathways. The equity assessment standard brings community perspectives into both the local vision and the selection of adaptation strategies. Communities, like Julio said, should help shape the local vision so that the priorities and needs of vulnerable populations are reflected in the planning goals. For example, when selecting adaptation strategies for the 0.8-foot sea level rise scenario, you need to consider who benefits and who could be burdened. Strategies should maximize community benefits, strengthen community and tribal capacity, and reduce inequities wherever possible. It is important to consider potential unintended consequences, including short and long-term impacts on socially vulnerable communities and how strategies can be adjusted to reduce harm. Again, the intended outcome is to help guide strategy development by bringing in community priorities and lived experience alongside identified vulnerabilities so that these decisions reflect what communities need and value on the ground. This matters because adaptation strategies can create both benefits and burdens, and without equity considerations, some communities may be left out of the experience unintended harm and experience unintended harm, even when strategies are well intended. For element D, for land use and policy plan, the equity assessment standard looks at how proposed land use changes affected communities. This means considering impacts on community health and well-being, current and future displacement risk, and how changes may affect the location and quality of resources and services, including critical infrastructure and tribal resources. It also means considering community benefits beyond flood risk reduction, such as improved access to resources, amenities, and other positive outcomes. Centering equity in this element can reduce displacement risk, improve access to resources over time, and that in turn will support community well-being, strengthen community stability, and improve long-term outcomes for everybody. For element F, the equity assessment asks you to consider how funding and resources support vulnerable communities. This includes identifying where funding can be prioritized and funneled to projects that directly benefit these communities, which will help ensure that economic opportunities are equitable. It also involves describing any community benefit agreements, which can provide local hiring opportunities for, let's say, construction, monitoring, outreach, and other activities. Embedding equity in element F infuses the community's priorities into the implementation steps and funding decisions, which ensures resources reach the communities that need them the most. This also ensures adaptation investments advance both resilience and equity. Without this, the funding and implementation decisions can miss the communities most in need of investment or can reinforce existing disparities. The result of doing the equity assessment for all of the elements up to this point is a creation of projects that reflect and prioritize the vulnerable communities that you're working with. For element G, we are asking you to put all of that hard work and collaboration into a list of priority projects, which will provide flood risk reduction and other benefits for vulnerable communities. The equity assessment in element G ensures the final projects reflect the full range of priorities from across the planning process and directs benefits to the communities that need them. The intent is to avoid project selection that can unintentionally favor more resourced communities and or reinforce, again, existing disparities, and make sure that who benefits first from the adaptation efforts is vulnerable communities. As we close out this section, it's important to talk about how success is evaluated. This will look very different for every plan because each community is very different. Its needs, priorities, and conditions are different. Evaluation is done on a case-by-case basis, grounded in local context. The intent is not strict one-to-one compliance with every requirement, but consistent engagement with the same core equity considerations. Where a standard cannot be met, jurisdictions should explain why it is not feasible given local constraints. Implementing the RSAP guidelines is still new, and we will continue refining our approach based on experience and feedback from practitioners and community-based organizations. At the same time, expectations for meaningful environmental justice engagement remain high. The focus is on demonstrating a clear, good faith effort to integrate equity throughout the entirety of the planning process and ensuring it is thoughtfully reflected in a way that fits the community that you're working with. As I talked through the framework, you might be asking, what does this actually look like in practice? And in part 3, Nama will talk about just that.
Thank you, Dalila. Great to be in community with all of you. I'm going to shift us from the framework into what it looks like in practice. I'll walk through a few examples from Sea Level Rise Resiliency Project, the Watershed Project is currently working on, and how we approach community engagement differently depending on the context. Before getting into example, I want to ground this in a few best practices for meaningful community engagement. All of this is documented at length in the RSAP, but there's a few things I want to pull out. First is inclusion. This means engaging a diverse range of participants. For the RSAP, it's especially important to focus on disadvantaged communities, ensuring we reach those most impacted. That being said, just a reminder to also widen the conversation as much as possible and include as many voices from the community as you can. An example, make an effort to reach out to youth, seniors, business owners, inland residents, and many more. This is something Dalila already talked about. To be inclusive also means removing barriers to participation, and this is something Julia mentioned, such as language barriers, transportation and childcare needs, and finding meeting times and locations that work for your community. This is often the most challenging thing to do. Second is collaboration. This is about creating spaces for dialogue. Start by crafting strong educational and engagement plans to ensure that community engagement aligns with the project goals and is a good fit for your community. Next, develop engagement materials that support your engagement plan. These materials not only translate complex technical issues into something understandable, but also provides a base for engaging learning activities and meaningful discussion through which you can collect the information you're looking for. Third is empowerment. Engagement should focus on decisions that people can actually influence. We should not be asking community members to weigh in on issues that are too technical or already decided. To do this, outreach needs to be aligned with the technical RSAP timeline, so community input comes at the right moment and can actually shape decisions. Fourth is contextual understanding. This means grounding engagement in the realities of your specific communities, collaborating with local community leaders, weaving in local stories, and connecting discussions to issues that are relevant to the community and the geographical area. And finally, accountability by iteration. It's important to see community engagement as a process that also gives to the community and is not only extracting from the community. The goal is to maintain collaborations and trust beyond the specific project completion. This is another reason why working with a trusted local CBO that is already invested in the community is a big advantage. One easy thing to do is to share updates on project progress and information on how community input was used or was not used through continuing engagement over time, whether through meetings, newsletters, or end-of-project events. Next slide, please. Thank you. In North Richmond, we took a long-term relationship-based approach. This is an unincorporated environmental justice community facing multiple challenges: language barrier, access limitation, creek flooding, air pollution, low-grade and aging infrastructure, and now also compounded by sea level rise. We recruited 20 community members and worked with them closely over a period of over a year. We met monthly with technical teams, both at the design table through multiple site tours, and the community leaders were compensated for their time with us because we consider what they're doing with us as work. In these meetings, community members and the technical teams, planners, engineers, designers, and the project owner, the West County Wastewater District, worked together. This greatly improved the understanding of the design needs and challenges in real time. Each session started with building capacity, helping participants understand the topic before moving into discussions and feedback on needs, design, and priorities. The engagement process included online sessions, in-person meetings, and many site tours. This model allowed for deep engagement and capacity building, but it also requires a lot of time and resources, which is not always possible in other contexts. Next one, please. In the city of Richmond, we took a different approach. We knew that there were already many strong and active existing structures through community groups, organizations, and neighborhood councils. The goal was to meet residents in their own spaces and build on existing leaderships. We join neighborhood councils and community organizations in their meetings, speaking with their members, bringing tailored presentations and activities based on the group and on the stage of the RSAP. This required significant coordination and many evening attending meetings, but it was worth it. It allowed us to better understand the range of needs and perspectives across the community while strengthening existing structures rather than creating new ones. Next slide, please. In Contra Costa County, the challenge is scale. The shoreline includes very different communities, from the western areas that have already been advancing sea level rise resiliency work, to central cities, to the delta and agricultural communities facing very different challenges. At the same time, RSAP deliverables are consistent, which means that timeline, budget, and resources are tight. So we're developing a cohort-based approach, dividing the shoreline into several geographic segments. Each cohort will include community members and also a few agency stakeholders to strengthen collaboration and improve the effectiveness of the process. We're currently in the recruitment phase, planning to include both new participants and those already engaged in related efforts, such as the BCDC Sea Level Rise Learning Academy in Contra Costa, which will end next month in June. Here as well, we are aligning engagement with the technical process, planning cohort meetings that coincide with key RSAP milestones so community input can be integrated in a timely way. Thank you. In Hayward, we are focusing specifically on tribal engagement. Early on, we identified with the partners an opportunity to develop something unique, a co-benefit project for tribes along the shoreline as part of the Shoreline Resiliency Plan. We're working with the Confederate Villages of Lishan, with whom we have long-standing relationships through our many projects, to better understand priorities, interests, and what the project could look like. This approach is intentionally different from more traditional engagements. It starts with being on the land together, building shared understanding, and creating space for open conversations before asking for specific input. It also reflects some of the realities of doing this work. Many tribes have limited capacity and are being approached by multiple efforts at the same time. So engagement needs to be thoughtful and respectful of their time. For the RSAP, this means focusing on relationship building, being clear about what we are asking for and why, and identifying opportunities for engagement that can lead to something tangible and meaningful for the tribe. It's still early in the process, but it's a good example of how the engagement approach can shift depending on the context and the opportunity. Next slide. It's important to note that all these outreach engagement examples that I provided are just one part of a broader engagement strategy. Meaningful engagement requires a layered approach. This includes community-wide workshops, tabling at local events, and multiple communication channels. No single method is enough on its own. The goal is to create multiple entry points for participation. Next slide. So to close, just a few key takeaways. First, I hope these examples show that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. Engagement should be designed to fit the community and the specific region. Second, engagement acts as a bridge between technical teams and agencies and the community. This is a two-way process, ensuring community input informs decision and ensuring that technical teams and agencies provide the information and materials needed for effective engagement. And finally, one important understanding I'd like you to take with you is that community engagement is a professional practice. It requires expertise, time, and resources, and should be treated as a core part of the work.
Thanks, Nama. Sorry, it took me a moment to find my unmute button. So now that we've walked through the equity assessment standard and its real-world application, let's take away some highlights from the webinar. So first, I hope you understand why we feel that equity is foundational to the RSAP. The RSAP and equity assessment standard were co-developed with equity and environmental justice leaders, which ground them in community-informed perspectives. Third, the equity assessment standard is embedded across all elements of the guidelines, so it is a part of every step in the planning process. And lastly, it helps to ensure that adaptation decisions reflect community priorities, maximize benefits, and consider potential impacts. BCDC has many resources to support you in your planning efforts. Our website includes tools to help advance your planning, as well as a tracker to see progress of sub-regional plans across the region. Each local government also has a dedicated sub-regional liaison listed on our webpage. And we ask you to reach out to your liaison if you have any questions related to your sub-regional plan. We also want to highlight our newest resource, which is centered around community engagement. This brings together all the engagement requirements that are spread throughout the RSAP into one place and is designed as a practical reference to support jurisdictions and planning teams in developing your community engagement approach. You can find this in our resource library, and we're also sharing the link in the chat. And as we close out this webinar, we'd love for you to take our feedback survey. Also, please sign up for our newsletter, stay informed if you aren't already on it. We regularly share updates on resources and jurisdiction progress in these newsletters, so it's a great way for us to connect. And then lastly, you can also browse through our YouTube channel and watch any of the webinars that you may have missed. So finally, I want to thank you so much for joining us and thank all of the participants today. We're now going to move on to the Q&A portion. This part of the webinar won't be included in the recording, but we will be posting all questions and answers in a document on our website.